I never planned for it to happen. One moment, I was just another woman trying to reclaim a part of herself in the gym. The next, I was standing at the top of the stairs, my husband watching from below, and another man following me into the bedroom. It wasn't guilt that rushed through me, it was something else entirely. And the craziest part? I didn't regret a single thing. The door shut behind me with a dull thud, sealing me inside a space that felt nothing like my own. The air was thick with the scent of rubber mats, sweat, and something almost metallic, like effort itself, had seeped into the walls. My grip tightened on the strap of my bag as I took a hesitant step forward, the weight of uncertainty pressing against my chest. The place was alive with motion. Weights clanged against metal, treadmills hummed in steady rhythms, and people moved with practiced ease, their bodies pushing limits I couldn't begin to imagine. I lingered near the entrance, gripping my water bottle, feeling the slight pinch of my leggings against my thighs, a physical reminder of why I was here in the first place. I had never considered myself out of shape, not really. But things had changed. Softness had settled in where there used to be firmness, and gravity had taken liberties I wasn't ready to accept. It wasn't about weight, it was about the slow loss of something that had once made me feel strong, capable, present in my own skin. Now, I wasn't sure what I was anymore. Taking a breath, I forced myself to move deeper into the gym. The machines stood in neat rows, their functions both obvious and entirely mysterious. I had watched videos, read guides, even rehearsed in my head how to adjust the settings. But standing in front of them, everything blurred into a maze of unfamiliar shapes and complicated mechanisms. I stopped in front of what I thought was a leg press, crouching down to adjust the seat. The metal was cool under my fingers as I fumbled with the levers, twisting one, then another, hoping I was doing it right. A quiet chuckle sounded nearby, barely noticeable over the clatter of weights, but enough to make my stomach drop. Straightening too quickly, I knocked my water bottle off the machine. It hit the floor and rolled a few feet away. My heart skipped as I turned, and my gaze landed on a man standing nearby, a hint of amusement on his face. He looked younger than me, maybe late 20s, lean and fit in a way that suggested he belonged here. His black t-shirt clung to his frame, muscles evident but not excessive. There was an ease to him, like this place was as familiar as his own home. He bent down, scooping up my water bottle with effortless grace before holding it out. I hesitated for half a second before taking it, my fingers brushing against his for the briefest moment. The warmth of his skin sent an unexpected jolt through me, though I quickly pulled away, gripping the bottle tightly. His gaze flicked toward the machine I had been struggling with, and a knowing look crossed his face. Whatever I had been attempting, I had clearly done it wrong. He stood there for a moment, arms crossed, exuding the kind of confidence that only came from experience. There was no judgment in his posture, just quiet understanding. I shifted on my feet, suddenly feeling the full weight of my own uncertainty. The gym had already felt like a test I wasn't prepared for, and now I had an unexpected witness to my failure. A slight nod from him, as if acknowledging that this wasn't unusual, that everyone had been here once, even if it didn't seem like it. Something about that made the tension in my shoulders ease, just a little. He introduced himself as someone who worked here, his tone easy, unbothered. That explained why he looked so at home, why he had noticed me fumbling through something I clearly didn't understand. His next question came naturally, like he had asked it 100 times before. A simple, casual curiosity about whether I had a plan or was just figuring it out as I went. The laugh that escaped me was quiet, almost involuntary. Figuring it out was an understatement. He must have caught on because the faint amusement on his face softened into something more helpful. A silent offer, a suggestion that he could show me around, help me get started. For a moment, hesitation crept in. I hadn't expected to talk to anyone, let alone have someone guide me through this first awkward step. But the alternative was standing here alone, lost in a sea of unfamiliar equipment and silent self-doubt. I nodded. His motion for me to follow was smooth, unforced, like it didn't matter whether I belonged here yet or not. As I fell into step beside him, I watched the way he moved, fluid, confident, completely at ease. It was the kind of presence I had once had, or at least thought I had, before life wore it down. Maybe, with time, I could find a little of that again, Over the next few days, stepping into the gym became a little less intimidating. The overwhelming sense of unfamiliarity was still there, but it no longer felt like I was trespassing in a space I didn't belong. The machines, though still foreign, had lost some of their mystery. Each time I arrived, I went through the same routine, adjusting my bag, gripping my water bottle a little too tightly, scanning the room for a place to start. The nervous energy didn't fade, but it dulled at the edges, replaced by something closer to determination. Sam was there most of the time, moving effortlessly from one machine to another, checking in on different people, guiding movements with an ease that made it seem like second nature. I had never really paid attention to trainers before, but now I noticed the way he worked, not just directing but observing, reading body language, knowing when to push and when to hold back. It didn't take long for our interactions to become routine. He'd catch sight of me, nod in acknowledgement, sometimes offering a brief comment about my posture or reminding me to keep my shoulders back. At first, I had no idea whether he was doing it because it was his job or because he actually cared. But something in his tone, casual, but never dismissive, made me think he wasn't just going through the motions. The workouts were hard. I had underestimated just how weak I had let myself become. The first time I tried to squat with a barbell, my legs shook under the weight, and my arms burned from the strain of gripping too tightly. Every part of my body felt resistant, unaccustomed to being pushed past comfortable limits. Still, I kept coming back. The soreness settled deep, lingering long after I had left the gym. Sitting down felt like a battle. Walking upstairs made my muscles scream in protest. But there was something satisfying about it, something that reminded me I was doing something real, something that mattered. Sam noticed the effort. He never said much, but I caught the small glances of approval, the slight nods when I pushed through an exercise without stopping. The validation felt good, too good, maybe. I started paying more attention to the way he moved, the way he carried himself. He wasn't the biggest guy in the gym, not the most intimidating, but there was a quiet authority to him, a way of existing in the space that made people take notice. Other women certainly noticed. I caught them watching him, sometimes openly, sometimes with quick glances when they thought no one was looking. It didn't surprise me. He had the kind of presence that drew people in. What did surprise me was the way it made me feel. There was no reason for me to care. I was here for myself, for my own goals. And yet, every time his attention landed on me instead of them, a strange sense of satisfaction bloomed in my chest. It was ridiculous, really, the idea that I had anything to compete for. But the feeling lingered. One evening, after an especially grueling session, I sat on the edge of the mat, catching my breath. My legs felt like they were made of lead, my muscles trembling from exertion. Sam dropped down beside me, stretching his arms over his knees, watching the gym with an easy familiarity. He wasn't looking at me, not directly, but there was something in his posture that made me feel like he was aware of my presence in a way that went beyond just being a trainer. After a moment, he made a quiet comment, something about how hard I had been working, how progress was already showing. It wasn't flattery. It felt more like an observation, something he had noticed rather than something he was saying to be polite. I wanted to brush it off, to downplay it, but the words settled into my chest in a way I wasn't prepared for. It had been a long time since someone had noticed me like that. Not just the effort, but me. The gym was emptying out, the sounds of weights and machines fading into the hum of quiet conversations and distant music. The air was thick with the smell of sweat and rubber, the kind of scent that would have repelled me once but now felt familiar. For the first time in years, I liked the way my body ached. I liked the way I felt sitting there, knowing I had pushed myself beyond what I thought I could handle. And more than anything, I liked that someone else had seen it too. The changes started small, so subtle that I almost didn't notice them at first. My posture shifted. My steps felt a little steadier. The soreness that once left me dreading stairs now felt like proof that I was doing something right. The mirror didn't show drastic differences yet, but I could sense them beneath the surface. At home, the routine remained unchanged. The quiet spaces between my husband and me grew longer, the conversations shorter. He didn't seem to notice that I was getting up earlier, that my evenings no longer revolved around the same mindless habits. If he did, he didn't mention it. But I noticed. I caught glimpses of myself in windows, the way my shoulders sat a little straighter, the way my clothes fit differently. I felt a shift, a quiet confidence that hadn't been there before. It wasn't about the weight or the muscles, it was something deeper, something I had forgotten I was capable of feeling. At the gym, I settled into a rhythm. The initial awkwardness of navigating the space had faded. I knew where to go, what to do, and I no longer felt like an outsider. Sam was always there. Not hovering, not overbearing, but present. His observations were quiet but constant. A simple nod when I lifted heavier than the week before. A slight adjustment of my stance when I struggled with form. A glance of approval when I pushed past the moment I wanted to quit. I wasn't sure when it started to feel different. Maybe it was the way he looked at me, not with the polite indifference of a trainer simply doing his job, but with something more curious, more interested. Maybe it was the way I started looking at him, catching myself noticing details I had no reason to focus on. I had always assumed attraction was something obvious, something sharp and immediate. But this was slower, creeping in through the smallest moments, the ease of his movement, the way his voice lowered when he spoke just to me, the way he seemed to recognize things I hadn't even admitted to myself. The first time my husband acknowledged the changes, it was in passing. "You've been at the gym a lot lately," he said one evening, his eyes flicking toward me in the mirror as I brushed my hair. There was no accusation in his tone, but there was something else. Curiosity, maybe. Or suspicion. I shrugged, keeping my expression neutral. "I like how it makes me feel." He nodded, but his gaze lingered for a second longer before he turned back to his phone. That was the moment I realized he was starting to see it too. But he wasn't the only one. At the gym, I caught glimpses of other women watching Sam, the same way I had when I first started. They smiled a little longer when they spoke to him, adjusted their ponytails when he passed by. I should have ignored it. I wasn't in this for attention. But every time his focus landed on me instead of them, a quiet satisfaction settled in my chest. It was ridiculous, really. And yet, when he stood a little closer than necessary, when his hands brushed against my back to correct my form, I didn't move away. I told myself it was nothing. But deep down, I wasn't so sure anymore. The shift was almost imperceptible at first, something that could be brushed off as coincidence or overthinking. A glance held for a second longer than necessary, a touch that lingered just slightly past the point of casual. But once I noticed it, I couldn't unsee it. Sam had always been attentive, adjusting my form, correcting my grip, encouraging me through the toughest sets. But now, his presence felt different. More intentional. The way he stood close when I struggled with a movement, his voice low, steady, coaxing me to push through. The way his hand would brush against the small of my back, guiding, adjusting, but never more than necessary. And yet, it was enough. Enough to send a spark up my spine, to make me hyper-aware of the space between us. One evening, after a particularly grueling session, I was stretching on the mat, trying to loosen the tension in my muscles. My legs ached, my arms felt like dead weight, and every inch of me was exhausted. Sam crouched beside me, watching with an expression that wasn't quite his usual easy amusement. His hands moved to my thigh, pressing lightly as he guided the stretch, his touch firm but careful. There was nothing inappropriate about it, trainers did this all the time. But the warmth of his hands, the quiet, focused way he watched me, made my breath hitch for just a second. I told myself I was imagining it, that this was no different from every other time he had corrected my posture or steadied me through a difficult rep. But when I glanced up, his gaze was already on me, unreadable, assessing. And then, just like that, he pulled away. I exhaled, telling myself it was nothing. But later that night, as I lay in bed next to my husband, his back turned, his breathing slow, and even I felt the echo of that touch, the phantom warmth of it lingering long after it was gone. The next day, I pushed myself harder than usual. I increased the weights, added extra sets, anything to burn through the restless energy twisting in my stomach. By the time we finished, my muscles were trembling, sweat dripping down my spine. Sam leaned against the squat rack, arms crossed, watching me with something like quiet approval. His voice was casual when he spoke, but there was something else beneath it, something unreadable. "You're going to feel this tomorrow," he said. I barely had the energy to nod. And then, so casually it could have been nothing, he offered a suggestion. A massage, just to work out the tension before it settled too deep. The words were harmless, professional even. But the way he looked at me as he said them wasn't. I hesitated just long enough for the silence between us to shift, heavy with something unspoken. Then, without thinking too hard about what it meant, I nodded. The personal training room was smaller, quieter, away from the main gym floor. The door clicked shut behind me, muffling the sounds of weights and treadmills. I lay down on the padded table, my breath a little too controlled, my heart beating just slightly too fast. His hands started at my shoulders, pressing carefully, searching for tension. His touch was firm, practiced, easing out the tightness that had settled into my muscles. The silence between us stretched, thickened. The air felt warmer than it should have. As he moved lower, working down my back, his fingers traced along my spine with a deliberate slowness that made my skin prickle. Every movement was professional, every press of his hands justified. And yet, there was an edge to it, something that hummed beneath the surface. I kept my eyes closed, pretending not to notice. Pretending it was just a massage, nothing more. But when he finally pulled away, his touch lingering just a fraction of a second longer than necessary, I knew I had already crossed a line even if I hadn't taken a single step. And I wasn't sure I wanted to turn back. The moment settled over me like a weight I couldn't shake. The room was too quiet, too charged, the echo of his touch lingering long after he had stepped back. I sat up slowly, rolling my shoulders as if that would somehow loosen the knot tightening in my chest. He stood a few feet away, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. The usual easy confidence was still there, but beneath it, something flickered, something unspoken. I wondered if he felt it too, that pull, the unsteady line we had been towing for weeks. By the time I left the gym that night, my thoughts were tangled, my body still buzzing with adrenaline that had nothing to do with the workout. At home, everything was the same. My husband sat in his usual spot on the couch, scrolling through his phone, barely acknowledging my presence. The routine felt predictable, like a script we had been repeating for years without deviation. But I had changed, even if he hadn't noticed yet. I stood in front of the mirror longer than usual that night, studying my reflection. The subtle definition in my arms, the way my posture had shifted. But it wasn't just physical. There was something else in my eyes, something sharper, more aware. The next day, I didn't hesitate before sending the message. "Dinner at our place tonight?" The reply came quickly. "Sounds good." When my husband got home, I mentioned it casually, slipping it into the conversation as if it were nothing. His reaction was immediate, shoulders tensing, his eyes flickering with something close to suspicion. He didn't argue, didn't ask why. Just nodded. The meal was a quiet battleground. The tension sat heavy at the table, unspoken but impossible to ignore. My husband watched. Sam watched. And I sat between them, fully aware of the invisible thread stretching tight between all three of us. Every glance, every shift of weight, every carefully measured word was another move in a game no one wanted to name. After dinner, as I cleared the plates, my husband leaned against the counter, his voice low, careful. "What's going on?" I met his gaze, holding it steady. "Nothing you need to worry about." A muscle in his jaw tightened. But he didn't push. When I walked back into the living room, Sam was still there, waiting. I held his gaze for just a second longer than necessary, then motioned for him to follow. Upstairs. The silence stretched as we climbed the steps. My husband didn't stop me. He didn't say a word. But I knew he understood exactly what was happening. And I didn't care.